Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're continuing reading today from Oliver Twist, starting with Chapter 7, Oliver Continues Refractory. Noah Claypole ran along the streets at his swiftest pace and paused not once for breath until he reached the workhouse gate. Having rested here for a minute or so to collect a good burst of sobs in an imposing show of tears and terror, he knocked loudly at the wicket and presented such a rueful face to the aged pauper who opened it that even he, who saw nothing but rueful faces about him at the best of times, started back in astonishment. "Why, what's the matter with the boy?" said the old pauper. "Mr. Bumble, Mr. Bumble," cried Noah with well-affected dismay, and in tones so loud and agitated that they not only caught the ear of Mr. Bumble himself, who happened to be hard by, but alarmed him so much that he rushed into the yard without his cocked hat, which is a very curious and remarkable circumstance, as showing that even a beetle, acted upon by a sudden and powerful impulse, may be afflicted with a momentary visitation of loss of self-possession and forgetfulness of personal dignity. "Oh, Mr. Bumble, sir," said Noah. "Oliver, sir, Oliver has—" "What? What?" interposed Mr. Bumble with a gleam of pleasure in his metallic eyes. "Not run away? He hasn't run away, has he, Noah?" "No, sir, no, not run away, sir, but he's turned vicious," replied Noah. "He tried to murder me, sir, and then he tried to murder Charlotte, and then Mrs. Oh, what dreadful pain it is, such agony, please, sir." And here Noah writhed and twisted his body into an extensive variety of eel-like positions, thereby giving Mr. Bumble to understand that from the violent and sanguinary onset of Oliver Twist, he had sustained severe internal injury and damage, from which he was, at the moment, suffering the acutest torture. When Noah saw that the intelligence he communicated perfectly paralyzed Mr. Bumble, he imparted additional effect thereunto by bewailing his dreadful wounds 10 times louder than before, and when he observed a gentleman in a white waistcoat crossing the yard, he was more tragic in his lamentations than ever, rightly conceiving it highly expedient to attract the notice and rouse the indignation of the gentleman aforesaid. The gentleman's notice was very soon attracted, for he had not walked 3 paces when he turned angrily round and inquired what that young cur was howling for, and why Mr. Bumble did not favor him with something which would render the series of vocabular exclamations so designated an involuntary process. "It's a poor boy from the free school, sir," replied Mr. Bumble, "who has been nearly murdered, all but murdered, sir, by young Twist." "By Jove!" exclaimed the gentleman in the white waistcoat, stopping short. "I knew it. I felt a strange presentiment for the very first, that audacious young savage would come to be hung." "He has likewise attempted, sir, to murder the female servant," said Mr. Bumble with a face of ashy paleness. "And his missus," interposed Mr. Claypole. "And his master, too, I think you said, Noah," added Mr. Bumble. "No, he's out, or he would have murdered him," replied Noah. "He said he wanted to." "Ah, said he wanted to, did he, my boy?" inquired the gentleman in the white waistcoat. "Yes, sir," replied Noah, "and please, sir, missus wants to know whether Mr. Bumble can spare time to step up there directly and flog him, 'cause master's out." "Certainly, my boy, certainly," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat, smiling benignly and patting Noah's head, which was about 3 inches higher than his own. "You're a good boy, a very good boy. Here's a penny for you. Bumble, just step up to Sourberry's with your cane and see what's best to be done. Don't spare him, Bumble." "No, I will not, sir," said the beetle, adjusting the wax end which was twisted round the bottom of his cane for purposes of parochial flagellation. "Tell Sourberry not to spare him either. They'll never do anything with him without stripes and bruises," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat. "I'll take care, sir," replied the beetle, and the cocked hat and cane having been by this time adjusted to their owner's satisfaction, Mr. Bumble and Noah Claypole betook themselves with all speed to the undertaker's shop. Here the position of affairs had not at all improved, as Sourberry had not yet returned, and Oliver continued to kick with undiminished vigor at the cellar door. The accounts of his ferocity as related by Mrs. Sourberry and Charlotte were of so startling a nature that Mr. Bumble judged it prudent to parley before opening the door. With this view, he gave a kick at the outside by way of prelude, and then applying his mouth to the keyhole, said in a deep and impressive tone, "Oliver." "Come, you let me out," replied Oliver from the inside. Excuse me. "Do you know this here voice, Oliver?" said Mr. Bumble. "Yes," replied Oliver. "Ain't you afraid of it, sir? Ain't you a-trembling while I speak, sir?" said Mr. Bumble. "No," replied Oliver boldly. An answer so different from the one he had expected to elicit, and was in the habit of receiving, staggered Mr. Bumble not a little. He stepped back from the keyhole, drew himself up to his full height, and looked from one to another of the three bystanders in mute astonishment. "Oh, you know, Mr. Bumble, he must be mad," said Mrs. Sowerberry. "No boy in half his senses could venture to speak so to you." "It's not madness, ma'am," replied Mr. Bumble after a few moments of deep meditation. "It's meat." "What?" exclaimed Mrs. Sowerberry. "Meat, ma'am, meat," replied Bumble with stern emphasis. "You've overfed him, ma'am. You've raised an artificial soul and spirit in him, ma'am, unbecoming a person of his condition. As the board, Mrs. Sowerberry, who are practical philosophers, will tell you, what have paupers to do with soul or spirit? It's quite enough that we let 'em have live bodies. If you had kept the boy on gruel, ma'am, this would never have happened." "Dear, dear," ejaculated Mrs. Sowerberry, piously raising her eyes to the kitchen ceiling. "This comes of being liberal." The liberality of Mrs. Sowerberry to Oliver had consisted in a profuse bestowal upon him of all the dirty odds and ends which nobody else would eat. So there was a great deal of meekness and self-devotion in her voluntary remaining under Mr. Bumble's heavy accusation, of which, to do her justice, she was wholly innocent in thought, word, or deed. "Ah," said Mr. Bumble, when the lady brought her eyes down to earth again, "the only thing that can be done now that I know of is to leave him in the cellar for a day or so till he's a little starved down, and then to take him out and keep him on gruel all through his apprenticeship. He comes of a bad family. Excitable natures, Mrs. Sowerberry. Both the nurse and doctor said that mother of his made her way here against difficulties and pain that would have killed any well-disposed woman weeks before." At this point of Mr. Bumble's discourse, Oliver, just hearing enough to know that some further allusion was being made to his mother, recommenced kicking with a violence that rendered every other sound inaudible. Sowerberry returned at this juncture, and Oliver's offense having been explained to him with such exaggerations as the ladies thought best calculated to rouse his ire, he unlocked the cellar door in a twinkling and dragged his rebellious apprentice out by the collar. Oliver's clothes had been torn in the beating he had received. His face was bruised and scratched, and his hair scattered over his forehead. The angry flush had not disappeared, however, and when he was pulled out of his prison he scowled boldly on Noah and looked quite undismayed. "Now, you are a nice young fellow, ain't you?" said Sowerberry, giving Oliver a shake and a box on the ear. "He called my mother names," replied Oliver. "Well, and what if he did, you little ungrateful wretch?" said Mrs. Sowerberry. "She deserved what he said, and worse." "She didn't," said Oliver. "She did," said Mrs. Sowerberry. "It's a lie," said Oliver. Mrs. Sowerberry burst into a flood of tears. This flood of tears left Mr. Sowerberry no alternative. If he had hesitated for one instant to punish Oliver most severely, it must be quite clear to every experienced reader that he would have been, according to all precedents in disputes of matrimony established, a brute, an unnatural husband, an insulting creature, a base imitation of a man, and various other agreeable characters too numerous for recital within the limits of this chapter. To do him justice, he was, as far as his power went, it was not very extensive, kindly disposed toward the boy. Perhaps because it was his interest to be so, perhaps because his wife disliked him. The flood of tears, however, left him no resource, so he at once gave him a drubbing, which satisfied even Mrs. Sowerberry herself, and rendered Mr. Bumble's subsequent application of the parochial cane rather unnecessary. For the rest of the day he was shut up in the back kitchen in company with a pump and a slice of bread, and at night Mrs. Sowerberry, after making various remarks outside the door, by no means complimentary to the memory of his mother, looked into the room, and amidst the jeers and pointings of Noah and Charlotte, ordered him upstairs to his dismal bed. It was not until he was left alone in the silence and stillness of the gloomy workshop of the undertaker that Oliver gave way to the feelings which the day's treatment may be supposed likely to have wakened in a mere child. He had listened to their taunts with a look of contempt. He had borne the lash without a cry, for he felt the pride swelling in his heart which would have kept down a shriek to the last, though they had rousted him alive. But now, when there were none to see or hear him, he fell upon his knees on the floor, and hiding his face in his hands, wept such tears as God send for the credit of our nature few so young may ever have cause to pour out before him. For a long time Oliver remained motionless in this attitude. The candle was burning low in the socket when he rose to his feet. Having gazed cautiously round him and listened intently, he gently undid the fastenings of the door and looked abroad. It was a cold, dark night. The stars seemed, to the boy's eyes, farther from the earth than he had ever seen them before. There was no wind, and the somber shadows thrown by the trees upon the ground looked sepulchral and deathlike from being so still. He softly reclosed the door, and having availed himself of the expiring light of the candle to tie up in a handkerchief the few articles of wearing apparel he had, sat himself down upon a bench to wait for morning. With the first ray of light that struggled through the crevices in the shutters, Oliver rose and again unbarred the door. One timid look around, one moment's pause of hesitation. He had closed it behind him and was in the open street. He looked to the left and to the right, uncertain whither to fly. He remembered to have seen the wagons as they went out, toiling up the hill. He took the same route, and arriving at the footpath across the fields, which he knew after some distance led out again into the road, struck into it and walked quickly on. Along this same footpath, Oliver well remembered he had trotted beside Mr. Bumble when he first carried him to the workhouse from the farm. His way lay directly in front of the cottage. His heart beat quickly when he bethought himself of this, and he half resolved to turn back. He had come a long way, though, and should lose a great deal of time by doing so. Besides, it was so early that there was very little fear of his being seen, so he walked on. He reached the house. There was no appearance of its inmates stirring at that early hour. Oliver stopped and peeped into the garden. A child was weeding one of the little beds, and he stopped, and as he stopped, he raised his pale face and disclosed the features of one of his former companions. Excuse me. Oliver felt glad to see him before he went, for though younger than himself, he had been his little friend and playmate. They had been beaten and starved and shut up together many and many a time. "Hush, Dick," said Oliver, as the boy ran up to the gate and thrust his thin arm between the rails to greet him. "Is anyone up?" "Nobody but me," replied the child. "You mustn't say you saw me, Dick," said Oliver. "I am running away. They beat and ill-use me, Dick, and I am going to seek my fortune some long way off. I don't know where. How pale you are." "I heard the doctor tell them I was dying," replied the child with a faint smile. "I am very glad to see you, dear, but don't stop. Don't stop." Yes, I will, to say good-bye to you," replied Oliver. "I shall see you again, Dick. I know I shall. You will be well and happy." "I hope so," replied the child, "after I am dead, but not before. I know the doctor must be right, Oliver, because I dream so much of heaven and angels and kind faces that I never see when I am awake. Kiss me," said the child, climbing up the low gate and flinging his little arms round Oliver's neck. "Goodbye, dear. God bless you." The blessing was from a young child's lips, but it was the first that Oliver had ever heard invoked upon his head, and through all the struggles and sufferings and troubles and changes of his afterlife, he never once forgot it. Chapter 8. Oliver walks to London. He encounters on the road a strange sort of young gentleman. Oliver reached the stile at which the footpath terminated and once more gained the high road. It was 8 o'clock now. Though he was nearly 5 miles away from the town, he ran and hid behind hedges by turns till noon, fearing that he might be pursued and overtaken. Then he sat down to rest by the side of a milestone and began to think, for the first time, where he had better go and try to live. The stone by which he was seated bore in large characters an intimation that it was just 70 miles from that spot to London. The name awakened a new train of ideas in the boy's mind. London! That was a great large place. Nobody, not even Mr. Bumble, could ever find him there. He had often heard the old men in the workhouse, too, say that no lad of spirit need want in London, and that there were ways of living in that vast city which those who had bred up in country parts had no idea of. It was the very place for a homeless boy who must die in the streets unless someone helped him. As these things passed through his thoughts, he jumped upon his feet and again walked forward. He had diminished the distance between himself and London by full 4 miles more before he recollected how much he must undergo ere he could hope to reach his place of destination. As this consideration forced itself upon him, he slackened his pace a little and meditated upon his means of getting there. He had a crust of bread, a coarse shirt, and 2 pairs of stockings in his bundle. He had a penny, too, a gift of sour berries after some funeral in which he had acquitted himself more than ordinarily well, in his pocket. A clean shirt, thought Oliver, is a very comfortable thing, very, and so are 2 pairs of darned stockings, and so is a penny. But they are small helps to a 65 miles walk in winter time. But Oliver's thoughts, like those of most other people, although they were extremely ready and active to point out his difficulties, were wholly at a loss to suggest any feasible mode of surmounting them. So after a good deal of thinking to no particular purpose, he changed his little bundle over to the other shoulder and trudged on. Oliver walked 20 miles that day, and all that time tasted nothing but the crust of dry bed and a few draughts of water which he begged at the cottage doors by the roadside. When the night came, he turned into a meadow, and creeping close under a hayrick, determined to lie there till morning. He felt frightened at first, for the wind moaned dismally over the empty fields, and he was cold and hungry, and more alone than he had ever felt before. Being very tired with his walk, however, he soon fell asleep and forgot his troubles. He felt cold and stiff when he got up next morning, and so hungry that he was obliged to exchange the penny for a small loaf in the very first village through which he passed. He had walked no more than 12 miles when night closed in again, for his feet were sore and his legs so weak that they trembled beneath him. Another night passed in the bleak, damp air made him worse, and when he set forward on his journey next morning, he could hardly crawl along. He waited at the bottom of a steep hill till a stagecoach came up, and then begged of the outside passengers. But there were very few who took any notice of him, and even those told him to wait till they got to the top of the hill, and then let them see how far he could run for a halfpenny. Poor Oliver tried to keep up with the coach a little way, but was unable to do it by reason of his fatigue and sore feet. When the outsides saw this, they put their halfpence back into their pockets again, declaring that he was an idle young dog and didn't deserve anything, and the coach rattled away and left only a cloud of dust behind. In some villages, large painted boards were fixed up warning all persons who begged within the district that they would be sent to jail. This frightened Oliver very much and made him glad to get out of them with all possible expedition. In others, he would stand about the inn-yards and look mournfully at every one who passed, a proceeding which generally terminated in the landlady's ordering one of the postboys who were lounging about to drive that strange boy out of the place, for she was sure he had come to steal something. If he begged at a farmer's house, 10 to 1, but they threatened to set the dog on him, and when he showed his nose in a shop, they talked about the beetle which brought Oliver's heart into his mouth, very often the only thing he had there for many hours together. In fact, if it had not been for a good-hearted turnpike man and a benevolent old lady, Oliver's troubles would have been shortened by the very same process which put an end to his mother's. In other words, he would most assuredly have fallen dead upon the king's highway. But the turnpike man gave him a meal of bread and cheese, and the old lady, who had a shipwrecked grandson wandering barefooted in some distant part of the earth, took pity upon the poor orphan and gave him what little she could afford, and more, with such kind and gentle words and such tears of sympathy and compassion that they sank deeper into Oliver's soul than all the sufferings he had ever undergone. Early on the 7th morning after he had left his native place, Oliver limped slowly into the little town of Barnet. The window shutters were closed, the street was empty, not a soul had awakened to the business of the day. The sun was rising in all its splendid beauty, but the light only served to show the boy his own lonesomeness and desolation, as he sat with bleeding feet and covered with dust upon a cold doorstep. By degrees the shutters were opened, the window blinds were drawn up, and the people began passing to and fro. Some few stopped to gaze at Oliver for a moment or two, or turned round to stare at him as they hurried by, but none relieved him or troubled themselves to inquire how he came there. He had no heart to beg, and there he sat. He had been crouching on the step for some time, wondering at the great number of public houses. Every other house in Barnet was a tavern, large or small, gazing listlessly at the coaches as they passed through, and thinking how strange it seemed that they could do, with ease, in a few hours, what it had taken him a whole week of courage and determination beyond his years to accomplish, when he was roused by observing that a boy, who had passed him carelessly some minutes before, had returned, and was now surveying him most earnestly from the opposite side of the way. He took little heed of this at first, but the boy remained in the same attitude of close observation so long that Oliver raised his head and returned his steady look. Upon this, the boy crossed over, and walking close up to Oliver, said, "Hello, my covey, what's the row?" The boy who addressed this inquiry to the young wayfarer was about his own age, but one of the queerest-looking boys that Oliver had ever seen. He was a snub-nosed, flat-browed, common-faced boy enough, and as dirty a juvenile as one would wish to see, but he had about him all the airs and manners of a man. He was short of his age, with rather bow legs and little sharp, ugly eyes. His hat was stuck on the top of his head so lightly that it threatened to fall off every moment, and would have done so very often if the wearer had not had a knack of every now and then giving his head a sudden twitch which brought it back to its old place again. He wore a man's coat which reached nearly to his heels. He had turned the cuffs back halfway up his arm to get his hands out of the sleeves, apparently with the ultimate view of thrusting them into the pockets of his corduroy trousers, for there he kept them. He was, altogether, as roistering and swaggering a young gentleman as ever stood 4 feet 6, or something less, in his bluchers. "Hello, my covey, what's the row?" said the strange young gentleman to Oliver. "I am very hungry and tired," replied Oliver, the tears standing in his eyes as he spoke. "I have walked a long way. I have been walking these 7 days." "Walking for 7 days," said the young gentleman. "Oh, I see. Beak's order, eh? But," he added, noticing Oliver's look of surprise, "I suppose you don't know what a beak is, my flash companion?" Oliver mildly replied that he had always heard a bird's mouth described by the term in question. "My eyes, how green!" exclaimed the young gentleman. "Why, a beak's a magistrate, and when you walk by a beak's orders, not straightforward, but always a going up and never a coming down again. Was you never on the mill?" "What mill?" inquired Oliver. "What mill? Why, the mill. The mill as takes up so little room that it'll work inside a stone jug, and always goes better when the wind's low with people than when it's high, because they can't get workmen." "But come," said the young gentleman, "you want grub, and you shall have it. I'm at low water mark myself, only one bob and a magpie, but as far as it goes, I'll fork out and stump. Up with you on your pins. There. Now then, Morris." Assisting Oliver to rise, the young gentleman took him to an adjacent chandler's shop, where he purchased a sufficiency of ready-dressed ham and a half-quartern loaf, or as he himself expressed it, a four-penny bran, the ham being kept clean and preserved from dust by the ingenious expedient of making a hole in the loaf by pulling out a portion of the crumb and stuffing it therein. Taking the bread under his arm, the young gentleman turned into a small public house and led the way to a tap room in the rear of the premises. Here a pot of beer was brought in by direction of the mysterious youth, and Oliver, falling to at his new friend's bidding, made a long and hearty meal, during the progress of which the strange boy eyed him from time to time with great attention. "Going to London?" said the strange boy, when Oliver had at length concluded. "Yes." "Got any lodgings?" "No." "Money?" "No." The strange boy whistled and put his arms into his pockets, as far as the big coat sleeves would let them go. "Do you live in London?" inquired Oliver. "Yes, I do when I'm at home," replied the boy. "I suppose you want some place to sleep in tonight, don't you?" "I do indeed," answered Oliver. "I have not slept under a roof since I left the country." "Don't fret your eyelids on that score," said the young gentleman. "I've got to be in London tonight, and I knows a 'spectable old gentleman as lives there what'll give you lodgings for nothing, and you never ask for the change. That is, if any gentleman he knows introduces you. And don't he know me? Oh, no, not in the least, by no means, certainly not." The young gentleman smiled, as if to intimate that the latter fragments of discourse were playfully ironical, and finished the beer as he did so. This unexpected offer of shelter was too tempting to be resisted, especially as it was immediately followed up by the assurance that the old gentleman already referred to would doubtless provide Oliver with a comfortable place without loss of time. This led to a more friendly and confidential dialogue, from which Oliver discovered that his friend's name was Jack Dawkins, and that he was a peculiar pet and protege of the elderly gentleman before mentioned. Mr. Dawkins' appearance did not say a vast deal in favor of the comforts which his patron's interest obtained for those whom he took under his protection, but as he had a rather flighty and dissolute mode of conversing, and furthermore avowed that among his intimate friends he was better known by the sobriquet of the Artful Dodger, Oliver concluded that, being of a dissipated and careless turn, the moral precepts of his benefactor had hitherto been thrown away upon him. Under this impression, he secretly resolved to cultivate the good opinion of the old gentleman as quickly as possible, and if he found the Dodger incorrigible, as he more than half suspected he should, to decline the honor of his further acquaintance. As John Dawkins objected to their entering London before nightfall, it was nearly 11 o'clock when they reached the turnpike at Islington. They crossed from the Angel into St. John's Road, struck down the small street which terminates at Sadler's Wells Theatre, through Exmouth Street and Coppice Row, down the little court by the side of the workhouse, across the classic ground which once bore the name of Hockley in the Hole, thence into Little Saffron Hill, and so into Saffron Hill the Great, along which the Dodger scudded at a rapid pace, directing Oliver to follow close at his heels. Although Oliver had enough to occupy his attention in keeping sight of his leader, he could not help bestowing a few hasty glances on either side of the way as he passed along. A dirtier or more wretched place he had never seen. The street was very narrow and muddy, and the air was impregnated with filthy odors. There were a good many small shops, but only the stock in trade appeared to be heaps of children, who even at that time of night were crawling in and out at the doors or screaming from the inside. The sole places that seemed to prosper amid the general blight of the place were the public houses, and in them the lowest orders of Irish were wrangling with might and main. Covered ways and yards, which here and there diverged from the main street, disclosed little knots of houses, where drunken men and women were positively wallowing in the filth, and from several of the doorways great ill-looking fellows were cautiously emerging, bound to all appearance on no very well-disposed or harmless errands. Oliver was just considering whether he hadn't better run away when they reached the bottom of the hill. His conductor, catching him by the arm, pushed open the door of a house near Field Lane, and drawing him into the passage, closed it behind them. "Now then," cried a voice from below, and was in reply to a whistle from the Dodger. "Plummy and slam," was the reply. This seemed to be some watchword or signal that all was right, for the light of a feeble candle gleamed on the wall at the remote end of the passage, and a man's face peeped out from where a balustrade of the old kitchen staircase had been broken away. "There's two on you," said the man, thrusting the candle farther out and shading his eyes with his hand. "Who's the t'other one?" "A new pal," replied Jack Dawkins, pulling Oliver forward. "Where did he come from?" "Greenland. Is Fagin upstairs?" "Yes, he's assorting the wipes. Up with you." The candle was drawn back and the face disappeared. Oliver, groping his way with one hand and having the other firmly grasped by his companion, ascended with much difficulty the dark and broken stairs, which his conductor mounted with an ease and expedition that showed he was well acquainted with them. He threw open the door of a back room and drew Oliver in after him. The walls and ceiling of the room were perfectly black with age and dirt. There was a deal table before the fire, upon which were a candle stuck in a ginger beer bottle, 2 or 3 pewter pots, a loaf and butter, and a plate. In a frying pan which was on the fire and which was secured to the mantelshelf by a string, some sausages were cooking, and standing over them, with a toasting fork in his hand, was a very old shriveled Jew, whose villainous-looking and repulsive face was obscured by a quantity of matted red hair. He was dressed in a greasy flannel gown, with his throat bare, and seemed to be dividing his attention between the frying pan and a clothes horse, over which a great number of silk handkerchiefs were hanging. Several rough beds made of old sacks were huddled side by side on the floor, and seated round the table were 4 or 5 boys, none older than the Dodger, smoking long clay pipes and drinking spirits with the air of middle-aged men. These all crowded about their associate as he whispered a few words to the Jew, and then turned round and grinned at Oliver, as did the Jew himself, toasting fork in hand. "This is him, Fagin," said Jack Dawkins, "my friend Oliver Twist." The Jew grinned, and making a low obeisance to Oliver, took him by the hand and hoped he should have the honor of his intimate acquaintance. Upon this, the young gentleman with the pipes came round him, and shook both his hands very hard, especially the one in which he held his little bundle. One young gentleman was very anxious to hang up his cap for him, and another was so obliging as to put his hands in his pockets in order that, as he was very tired, he might not have the trouble of emptying them himself when he went to bed. These civilities would probably have been extended much further but for a liberal exercise of the Jew's toasting fork on the heads and shoulders of the affectionate youths who offered them. "We are very glad to see you, Oliver." "Very," said the Jew. "Dodger, take off the sausages and draw a tub near the fire for Oliver. Ah, you're a-staring at the pocket handkerchiefs, eh, my dear? There are a good many of 'em, ain't there? We've just looked 'em out, ready for the wash. That's all, Oliver, that's all. Ha, ha, ha." The latter part of this speech was hailed by a boisterous shout from all the hopeful pupils of the merry old gentleman, in the midst of which they went to supper. Oliver ate his share, and the Jew then mixed him a glass of hot gin and water, telling him he must drink it off directly because another gentleman wanted the tumbler. Oliver did as he was desired. Immediately afterwards he felt himself gently lifted onto one of the sacks, and then he sank into a deep sleep. We'll stop there and start tomorrow with Chapter 9. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.